I want to welcome you tonight to our grand celebration of a great book. My name is Jacob Hornberger. I'm president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, the sponsor of this event tonight. I know most of you are familiar with FFF, but our mission is to present an uncompromising moral, philosophical, and economic case for the free society. In a label, we're libertarians, and we're an educational foundation that's been in existence since 1989. We have two main publications, a monthly journal called FFF, The Future of Freedom, and a daily publication that we send out called FFF Daily, consisting of libertarian articles, original articles on the burning issues of the day, as well as articles in the mainstream press and on the internet that we share with people. So we invite you to subscribe to those. This is a great celebration of a great book. Let me just give you one endorsement that reads as follows. A solid book in which Boettke concentrates on the primary purpose of economics, which is to convey an understanding of how markets generate and distribute value without overt conflict. And that was done by the late James Buchanan, Nobel Prize winner in economics. And when we learned about the book, we said, hey, we'd really like to have a program. The book was published by the Independent Institute, and we said we'd really like to have a program featuring Pete Boettke, who's been a longtime personal friend as well as a friend of the foundation, and just kind of bring it to the attention of a wider group of people. It's especially important in today's times. I mean, you see this revival of Austrian economics, especially among young people. The student groups that we've been speaking at lately, Students for Liberty, Young Americans for Liberty, it's absolutely amazing how well-versed students are in Austrian economics, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek. And so this book is in large part about Austrian economics, but as you'll see tonight, it goes far beyond that. It goes into the rich heritage of economics and what Pete calls the mainline study of economics. We've especially today with all the economic crises that are going around the world, the book has a special urgency, special importance. I mean, we're seeing really, in practical terms, the death of Keynesianism. Not everyone realizes that the reason we're having all these economic problems is tied to Keynesianism and statism in general and the welfare state and so forth. But that's our job as libertarians, as economists, to bring what's going on in the world to people's attention in terms of cause and effect. And I think more and more people are doing that. In addition to a personal friendship with Pete, we've always had, we've had for many years a nice working relationship with the GMU Econ Society, which is a student-run group there at GMU that's interested in libertarianism and Austrian economics. We have our monthly Econ Liberty lecture series with them, and Pete has spoken at that event. So it's a nice relationship that we've had with Pete and the GMU Econ Society over the years. The format tonight will be, I'll be introducing the three speakers all at once, and then Pete will give a 30-minute talk on the book and the principles of the book, and then he'll be followed by Sheldon Richman, the vice president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and then he'll be followed by Coyne, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion, Q&A, and so forth. Pete Boettke is the University Professor of Economics and Philosophy at George Mason University, the BB&T Professor for the Study of Capitalism, and the Director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Before joining the faculty at GMU in 1998, Pete taught at New York University. In addition, he was a National Fellow at the Hoover Institution for War, Revolution, and Peace at Stanford, and the F.A. Hayek Fellow in 2004 and 2006 at the London School of Economics. Additionally, he's been a visiting professor or scholar at the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow, the Max Planck Institute for Research into Economic Systems in Jena, Germany, the Stockholm School of Economics, Central European University in Prague, and the Charles University in Prague. He also serves as co-editor with Timur Kuran of Duke University on the Cambridge series in economics, Cognition and Society with Cambridge University Press. He is an affiliated faculty member in GMU's Russian Studies program, has taught at the GMU School of Law, and has served on dissertation committees in the School of Public Policy. He's also taught in the honors college programs at Oakland University, New York University, and George Mason University. He'll be followed by Sheldon Richman, who is the Vice President of the Future of Freedom Foundation and the editor of FFF's monthly journal, Future of Freedom. For 15 years, he was editor of The Freeman, published by the Foundation for Economic Education in Irvington-on-Hudson, New York. And he's the author of FFF's award-winning book, Separating School and State, How to Liberate America's Families, as well as Your Money or Your Life, Why We Must Abolish the Income Tax, and Tethered Citizens, Time to Repeal the Welfare State. Sheldon's articles on economic policy, education, civil liberties, American history, foreign policy, and the Middle East have appeared in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, American Scholar, Chicago Tribune, USA Today, Washington Times, American Conservative, The Freeman, and many, many other publications. He is a contributor to the Concise Encyclopedia of Economics, a former newspaper reporter and senior editor at the Cato Institute and the Institute for Humane Studies. Sheldon is a graduate of Temple University in Philadelphia, and he blogs at Free Association. Our third speaker will be Christopher Coyne, who is the F.A. Harper Professor of Economics at George Mason University and the Associate Director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center. He is also the co-editor of the Review of Austrian Economics, the co-editor of the Independent Review, and the book review editor of Public Choice. In 2008, he was named the Hayek Fellow at the London School of Economics, and in 2010, he was a visiting scholar at the Social Philosophy and Policy Center at Bowling Green University. Chris is the author of Doing Bad by Doing Good, Why Humanitarian Action Fails, After War, The Political Economy of Exporting Democracy, and the editor with Rachel Mathers of the Handbook on the Political Economy of War. In addition, he has authored numerous academic articles, book chapters, and policy studies. Would you please welcome Pete Boettke.
Thanks, Humper. It's always great to talk at FFF events, and I will try to stay within my time frame of doing this. I want to thank Bumper and Bart for putting this together, and I also want to thank Sheldon and Chris for putting the time in to provide comments, even though I haven't heard them yet. I want to thank them in advance. And I want to thank all of you for coming out to see this event, and some of you for buying the book and reading it. I've written a lot of books in my career. When I was a young graduate student, I went to an event that honored the great Murray Rothbard, and David Gordon had published a book on Rothbard and his career and the number of books that he published and the number of journal articles he published. And I was very close friends in graduate school, and still am, with two men, Dave Perchicko and Steve Horowitz, and we were all at this event together. And I made the boast that I'm going to do what Rothbard did. That was like my goal. So this is kind of conspicuous production kind of thing, you know. So I needed to make sure that I met the Rothbardian goal. And the idea was to publish 20 books in my lifetime and 500 journal articles. And that, you know, was the sort of idea, and I boasted that I would do that. And I've gone out to try to do that. So I published a lot of books. My background was mainly in Sovietology, was when I started, but also in economics and history of economic ideas. And I've never really promoted any of my books, you know, gone out and done any of that stuff. I just did it, moved on. But this book, I've promoted a lot. In fact, shamelessly promoted it. And it's a kind of an interesting reflection on me. I won't have an answer for you tonight, but I'm shamelessly promote this book because I get no proceeds from the book. Zero. Because I gave away all my rights to the university that inspired the book. And that will be a large part of the story that I tell today. So I feel completely restrained in telling you, buy this book, buy it for your sister, buy it for your brother, buy it for your grandmother, buy it for everyone, because everyone should be leaving economics, and you should buy. I'm almost like a Keynesian here, telling you to engage in aggregate demand, boost the aggregate demand for living economics. But let's start in on the little story here about this. So I want to tell you a little bit about the story behind this book. Chris Coyne is, my close colleague at George Mason University, and Chris and I think it's going on 3 years ago now, were invited to go to the University of Francisco Marroquín and serve as consultants for the university, which is an amazing, if you don't know about UFM, find out about it. It's an amazing story. A man named Manuel Ayau came to North America to study engineering, and he went originally to Canada, and then eventually he ended up by finishing at Louisiana State University with a degree in civil engineering, and then he moved back down to Guatemala where he wanted to engage in building. But there was no jobs for building. And so Manuel Ayau thought to himself, why isn't there any jobs for me to be building down here? And he started to study why it is that some countries engage in lots of economic activities and other countries are very restrained in their economic activities. This led him to an appreciation of the division of labor, and in particular the institutions that either encourage a thickening of the division of labor or don't. Okay? And that led him to set up an institute for the study of economic policy. And out of that institute later became the University Francisco Marroquín. And at the University of Francisco Marroquín, which has a medical school, a law school, a business school, a school of architecture, every student has to take economics. Not only just take one course in economics, but they have to take a year course in economics. Okay? Every student, whether or not you're going to be a dentist or an architect or whatever, you have to do it because Manuel Ayau wanted people to understand what are the preconditions to realize social cooperation under division of labor. Okay? The other thing about UFM is everywhere that you turn at in the physical plant are reminders that you should be studying economics. There's statues, there's naming. The auditorium is called the Milton Friedman Auditorium. The library is the Ludwig von Mises Library. You have the F.A. Hayek, seminar room. You have the new college that just got started is the Michael Polanyi College, and this seminar room in the Michael Polanyi College is the Carl Menger seminar room. Everywhere you go, and because it's a university that was founded by businessmen, they pay attention to detail in a way that you would never that academics would never pay attention to detail. We are too high up in the air. Businessmen, they have real attention to detail, and that's exactly from the moment you arrive in Guatemala to the moment you leave, everything is about the details. Now, the other thing that Chris will tell you is that we originally went down there and they gave us a nice hefty check to go down there because they needed to. Manuel Ayau passed away, and they were talking about where they're going to go in the future with everything. And so they had us down there, and they gave us a big hefty check. So we went down there. It was great, like that. But then what they did was they worked us until we were at the Guatemalan wage, basically. So, Chris and I were up at 6 o'clock at night and worked until midnight. And the other thing is Guatemala is very dangerous, as you know. Chris and I are kids from New Jersey, so we should be roughnecks a little bit, but actually we're, puff cakes. And so we were nervous, and the very first night, let's just imagine this scenario. We're in a hotel, nice hotel, but right across the street is a restaurant with beaming letters that says, best food in all of Guatemala. I'm exaggerating here, but imagine that. And then Chris and I say, well, maybe we should go over there for dinner. And so we ask our guide, hey, can we go over there? And he says, well, there's been a lot of kidnaps lately. I give it an 80% chance you'll be okay. Every night while we were down there, Chris and I came back and we're like, should we make it? And look at Chris, look at me. I realize Chris is okay. I'm the one getting kidnapped. So I'm like, no, we'll just eat a hamburger here in the hotel at midnight or whatever. But it was great, fantastic. And one of the things that was amazing about UFM, remember what I said about the symbolism on the campus, is everywhere you turn, they have some kind of thing. And in particular, from the business school over to the econ department, there's a mural on the wall. And that mural has all these great economists up on the wall. And Chris and I must have walked past it probably 10 times a day, every day that we were there. And I would look at it, and I would study it, and I realized, by the way, that I probably have said something in all of my writings about one of the people up on that wall, like in all of my different papers. Like, so then I started thinking, like, why is someone up on the wall and not another person up on the wall? Who gets up on the wall? Who doesn't get on the wall, right? And this sort of made me start, thinking about various different issues. And what I do in the book, I'm starting this talk a little different than I normally do, because I'm going to tell you about the broader thing and then come and tell you more about the structure of the book. But what I do in the book is I make a distinction between mainline economics and mainstream economics. Whereas mainline economics is a set of propositions. Here's the thought experiment I want you to do. Imagine that you're a Martian who's able to engage in time travel and space travel, okay? And you land on Earth in the year 1776. And you're an anthropological Martian, and you're interested in intellectual anthropology, okay? And you land there, and what you do is you say, what does it mean to be an economist? Now you get in your time travel machine and you go to 1850 and you say, what does it mean to be an economist? And then you go to 1920 and what does it mean to be an economist? And what I want to say is that there is something that's enduring and lasting about what it means to be an economist over that period of time and not wildly volatile. Like when Charles Dickens picks up pen to paper and attacks economics in hard times, all right? There's something that makes sense about that, just like when John Steinbeck picks up pen to paper and attacks economics in The Grapes of Wrath. That Dickens's criticism of what an economist believes is very similar to what Steinbeck says economists believe. And what I want to say is, they're right. That's what economists believe. And that's what we learn from Adam Smith going forward. And that is the main line of economics. It's a set of substantive propositions. And what I argue in the book, and I'll come back to more of this in a little, is that it's three things. Rational choice postulate, individuals pursue their self-interest, okay? And the invisible hand postulate, the market is a self-regulating mechanism. But the way in which I derive the invisible hand mechanism from the rational choice postulate is through institutional analysis, okay? In a lot of modern economics, the problem is that they forget this point about institutional analysis. And so we think that we're talking about an economics that has perfect actors interacting in perfect market structures, and therefore that's the only way you can get the invisible hand. When the reality is that we're dealing throughout the history of economics with agents who are fallible but capable, and markets that are in fact far from being perfect, but yet are robust. And the reason why they're robust is a set of institutional rules. So David Mitch is here, and he can tell you about the history of ideas, but the example that I use in the book, it is the discussion of, to show the invisible hand style of reasoning, is the discussion that Adam Smith has about education in Glasgow versus education in Oxford. And then also use the example of Hume and Smith on religion. So just to give you an idea of the nature of the style of argument that would cause the Martian to pay attention, is that Adam Smith was educated in Scotland, but also at Oxford because he was a very bright boy. But in Scotland, the professors were paid by student fees. There was no endowment, and the professors got their money by having the students pay fees directly to the professor. In Oxford, the professors were paid out of an endowment, and they didn't have any worry about the students' reaction to their teachings. So Smith, describing the environment, he says the following. He says, in Oxford, this is how professors taught. They sat with their robes, opened up a book, turned their back to the students and read. Okay? Whereas in Glasgow, the professors in Edinburgh, the professors were engaged with the students. In both cases, they're homo professornomicus, right? They want to do the best that they can for the least amount of effort that they possibly could. But the way in which that is manifested depends on the rules of the game under which they find themselves delivering those goods and services. So again, the invisible hand, right, of competition transforms, right, the rational choice behavior, but you can go in a mechanism where it leads to bad outcomes, quote unquote bad outcomes, which is the professors turning their back, not paying attention to students, or the good outcome, which is the professors engaging the students, right? Well, to give you another example of why that analysis could be called positive analysis or value-free analysis, let's take the example of religious education at the time of the Scottish Enlightenment. And you have two good friends, separated by somewhere around 10 years in age, but close colleagues and friends, David Hume and Adam Smith. Hume hates religion. Thinks it's a big problem. Smith actually likes religion. There's a debate going on in Europe at the time. Should the state sponsor religion? Or should religious education be something that's a free market? Hume hates religion. Which one do you think he would advocate? Yeah, that's what people might think. But no. Because remember the professors in Oxford versus the professors in Edinburgh. So if I want to reduce religiosity in society, what I should do is I should give the religious people a monopoly and then subsidize it. Because now on Sunday, when the guy goes and gives his sermons, he's boring. And therefore, I don't want to go. I don't have to listen to you because you're boring. You're not going to excite in me any kind of passion. I'm not going to get excited. On the other hand, Smith liked religiosity, so he wanted a free market in religion. Because then what would happen is in order to get people in the pews, I'd have to be like doing something exciting. And that would inspire in you religiosity. So note that both Hume and Smith accept the same analysis, but have different normative conclusions to it. Right? It's the analysis that's value-free. The conclusions are, in fact, value-laden. Now, so we have the substantive propositions. Now, what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is mainstream economics, I argue, is a sociological concept. That's a concept that is who's teaching at the fancy schools at this particular moment. And sometimes the mainstream and the mainline are identical to one another. And at other times, they deviate very far. And it's at those moments of deviation that you need intellectual entrepreneurs and schools of thought emerge. So it's precisely because of the dominance of Keynesianism and fiscal policy that you got monetarism. Right? Even the selection of the terms. Right? That I emphasize monetary side of things, monetary policy, the effective monetary policy. I'm going to be called a monetarist. The Austrian school, the public choice school. Adam Smith would have thought it's silly to have a separate school of thought called the economic analysis of politics. Right? David Hume, Smith's buddy, in his essay on the origins of parliament, writes, in designing a government, we must presume that all men are knaves. This is assumption number one of public choice. Hume had it all the way back then. So why would I have to reinvent it? Is because we had lost it, right? So the main line had deviated significantly from the mainstream. So that's the overarching theme of the book. Now let me just show you, hopefully this works. This will be quick. This is the campus in Europe. This is where Chris and I Sorry. So, let me see if I can get you to there. Leave this up. This is a quote from Mises that's at the end of the hall. One of the things I just noticed when you go through this, when they have the illumination lights on this presentation, it must mean that those are the figures that they really think. So you have to, on the wall, but then on the wall, not all animals are equal, right? So some of them are bigger lights. So anyway, so this, we went by this every day. This is also a major quote which influences a lot of the way the book is done. So I just wanted to leave that up for a second. So as I was walking through this, Chris and I started talking all the time, and we kept on asking ourselves our question, you know, who's on the wall, who isn't on the wall? So from Adam Smith to Vernon Smith, what unites them? What would make all of those people be able to get up on that wall? And what I want to suggest is that what unites them is an understanding of this invisible hand style of reasoning. Who's not on the wall? Thomas Malthus, Karl Marx. There's some people there. They can come on in. They just have to buy a copy of the book and give it to UFN. Yeah. John Maynard Keynes, Paul Krugman. So the question is, what disqualifies those people from being up on the wall? And I want to suggest that it's the explicit denial in their work of the invisible hand style of reasoning. Okay. So now what I want you to do is contemplate this cover and the title. And then this will help me. I have 10 more minutes, and I hope to get through this to explain, you know, the meaning. So I want to do a little riff on the meaning and the title so that you can see what I'm trying to do in the book. So economics, first thing is that economics is a scientific body of thought constantly evolving, constantly changing, constantly growing. It's living, okay? The book is very opinionated, but it's not a catechism. It's designed to be an invitation to inquiry. Let me explain who the book is written for. It's written for primarily advanced undergraduates who are deciding that they would like to become an economist, and I'm asking them to contemplate what type of economist do you want to be. And it is written for graduate students in economics, and I'm asking them, what kind of teacher of economics do you want to be? Okay, it's kind of an interesting twist, because graduate students are normally taught that the purpose of graduate school is not to become a teacher of economics, but to become a researcher of economics. In fact, teaching economics is for adults, right? It's a acculturation of our profession, which is, you know, hey, I went to graduate school because I read Adam Smith and Karl Marx, and I want to study the big questions. Oh, that's for mushy-headed people, right? Oh, I got into undergrad. Had an outstanding undergraduate teacher in economics. I want to teach people and really engage them in economics, you know. And they said, no, teaching, that's for silly people, right? And then the third kind of thing is, oh, I'm really excited about economics because I read John Kenneth Galbraith's op-eds, or I read Paul Krugman's op-eds, and I want to be a public intellectual doing economics. Says, oh, no. That's like the worst. Lester Thoreau, his nickname's Less Than Thorough, right? Right? So we don't want to do that. So you would suffer cognitive dissonance your first year in graduate school. And instead, what are you taught to do? Put your head down, learn theorems, learn economics, right? That's the nature of our game. I want to say to the students, hey, lift your head up, think twice about what kind of economist you want to be and what kind of teacher of economics that you want to be, okay? But the book itself, while opinionated, is an invitation to the wonderful world of economics and inquiry from an economic point of view, and the way in which that window of the world opens up to you. So this is a quote from my favorite economist, Ludwig von Mises. And I picked this because there's some kind of irony, because a lot of people believe Mises is an extremely wooden economist. And this is from his tome, Human Action. As he says here, economics is a living thing, and to live implies both imperfection and change. On the cover of the book, this is reflected by the various branches of the healthy tree, growing and extending in various different directions. The second meaning of the cover and the title, Living Economics and the Healthy Tree, is that a healthy tree, while constantly evolving, is deeply rooted. And that we have to see those roots deep. And what I try to do in the book is, following Lord Acton, I want to see that it's the men who travel in the seat of Adam Smith that are worthy of our attention. This is the point about the main line of economics, okay? And then finally, once you get excited about economics and truly understand its message, you can't stop thinking about economics. Economics is not a 9-to-5 occupation. It's a 24/7 way of living. So you actually literally live economics rather than so economics itself is a living body of thought, and the stakes that are involved are human civilization. So it's worthy of getting quite deep into. So what do I do in the book? The book's divided up into 3 parts. The first part is an effort by me to boil down for the reader what I consider the essential elements of teaching basic economics. Now, I have a textbook in economics that I was fortunate enough to inherit from the great Paul Hayne, one of the great teachers of economics, who unfortunately passed away too early, and he asked me if I would continue the textbook after his death. And so we have, it's called The Economic Way of Thinking. We just finished the edits for the 13th edition. One of the things about that book that we've tried to emphasize, learning from Paul's methods, was that you should teach economics as if it's the last class your students will ever have in economics, and it will be the first of many that they will take. What we too often do in the education of economics is we teach our students technique because that's a prerequisite to take the next advanced stage of course. So unless a student understands the geometry of economics, they can't then take the calculus of economics. If they can't take the calculus of economics, they can't take the set theory of economics. And so therefore, all the emphasis is on the techniques associated with economic reasoning, not economic reasoning. And I want to get students to think about economic reasoning. And so what are those core principles that emerge out of the teachings of economics, from Adam Smith to Vernon Smith? What's enduring and what's fleeting? The second part of the book is examples of great teachers that I personally have had. That's how the book is sort of autobiographical. It's great teachers that I'm in this room because I had a great undergraduate teacher in economics. His name was Hans Sennholz, and he totally transformed my life. I'm modestly successful in economics because I had an outstanding graduate professor in economics. His name was James Buchanan. All right? I, as a junior faculty member, benefited tremendously from the mentorship of Israel Kirzner, another great teacher and dedicated teacher of economics. As anyone has ever been exposed to him, is a fantastic teacher of economics. So I have had this great fortune of meeting and interacting with a lot of very good economists, and I try to communicate how it is that they tried to communicate economic ideas to the uninitiated or the not so bright, like myself, and try to get across economics. And then the third part of the book is how would the practice and teaching of economics change if we followed these great examples? So if you take seriously Hayek's claim that the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they know about what they imagine they can design, how actually would you do economics? Economics becomes a tool of social understanding, never a tool of social control. Yet we live in an intellectual culture that demands that economics be a tool of social control. How is it that the economist negotiates that struggle? Now, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip what I thought was, my normal thing here, because I took too long on the video. I apologize. Maybe we can come back to this. But what I want to do is, outside of the book, talk about the contemporary relevance of what I just said about the teaching and practice of economics for debates today. Because I think that Adam Smith still speaks to us about the debates that we're facing. Henry Hazlitt still speaks to us about the debates that we're having in this country, and perhaps we can come back to that in the Q&A. But let me end up by I have 2 more slides and I'll end up, so I'll go over just 2 minutes. What the book does is it very much tries to put at the forefront why it is that you should care about economic education, why you should allow yourself to be seduced by economics. Okay, so I see some young faces here. The goal is to totally corrupt your mind for the rest of your life so that you see the world through the lenses of economic way of thinking. That's how you see the world, and you become an evangelical advocate for economic science. Remember, an invitation to inquiry, not a catechism, but it's why it is that economics, and here it is. The sexiest thing, this young man's here, very young, right? Like supermodels appear sexy and things like that. The sexiest thing you will ever see is a supply and demand curve, right? It can unlock all the mysteries of the universe, from the mystery of the mundane having to do with how it is that you ended up by getting your tie and your shirt and all that stuff in the division of labor, to how it is that you choose to go to college, what kind of woman you date, or relationship that you engage in. Economics is embedded in how many kids you have, all of that, economics, everything. Economics is about all walks of human life, and it's the sciences of human action. And so it can be the most entertaining subject in the world. We can talk about the NCAA tournament. I'm in the Washington Post when George Mason had their run, right, into the Final Four. I'm in the Washington Post explaining homo basketballicus, right, and why it is that you follow certain strategies, given the rules of the game that players are going to play. It can also be the most important subject because ultimately it's about the wealth and poverty of nations. And that wealth and poverty of nations determines whether or not nations are rich and healthy or poor and sick. As a homework assignment, since I don't have time to do it here, look up Hans Riesling's BBC. It's called 200 Countries Over 200 Years in 4 Minutes. And it explains the phenomena of modern economic growth and what the stakes are that are involved in that. So I want to invite you into the world of economics. It's a fascinating world. And I also, in some sense, in this book, end up with an intellectual advertisement for what we do at George Mason University. Because we are a mainline economics tradition school. We train our students to think along these lines. Our scholars actually work and teach along these lines. And so this is what's behind the F.A. Hayek Center. There's a great quote from Hayek which says that nobody can be a great economist who is only an economist. And I'm even tempted to add that the economist who is only an economist is likely to become a nuisance, if not a positive danger. So our center is called the Center for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. So we're trying to resurrect a kind of mainline economics, but in the body of political economy in its greatest stage of moral philosophy and political economy. I often add, this is for Mark here, I often add a proviso at the end of this, or a caveat, I guess is the right word, which is that yes, it's true that nobody can be as dangerous as an economist who only knows economics, except a moral philosopher who knows no economics at all. They can be really, really dangerous. All right, but we are doing this at George Mason in terms of education. My colleague, Chris Coyne, is along with that, part of that tradition. We are dedicated to this idea that economics is the most fascinating of subjects, as well as dealing with the most important and pressing problems. And the book tries to get you to think about those things in the context of living economics. Okay, thank you very much, and I will leave it there.
Well, very nice to be here. I mean, I'm highly honored to have been included in this, and I can't think of anything more joyful than to spend a few minutes speaking about this book. I've read the book. I recently read the book, and the first thing I want to say is read the book. I can't give it a more enthusiastic endorsement. First of all, I want to thank Pete personally, and I'll explain what I mean by that. I had the wisdom to avoid a graduate work in economics. I didn't go to graduate school, so I avoided that rigmarole. And I could, on another occasion, tell you why I think that's a good thing. But one of the costs of doing that was that I was not exposed to many thinkers in political economy and related fields like sociology that I would have benefited from having been exposed to. And one of the things Pete's book will do for you is to teach you something about those people that are very important, people that you may not otherwise run into, like Peter Berger in sociology, and Kenneth Boulding, and other people who Pete learned from. But Pete has this admirable quality of being able to learn from a broad variety of thinkers, way beyond any kind of narrow band. And by reading his book, we get some of the benefit of that. And so he said this is a book for advanced undergraduates and graduate students. I'm coming to the book with a different perspective. And so I recommend this book to people who are not advanced undergraduates in economics or graduate students in economics or young professors or even old professors, but just somebody who is interested in economics. It's not a beginner's book. I don't want to lead anyone astray. But if you are interested in economics and you're literate and you're intelligent and you're really interested, you will enjoy this book. You'll get a lot from it. You don't feel you have to be inside the profession. So that's my thank you. Now, I love the cover. It's not up there right now. It's a wonderful cover. It's a very positive cover. Being the jaundiced person I am, if I had been asked to design the cover, I would have gone in a different direction. I would have been more negative, but the current mainstream as opposed to the main line. So, and here I'm going to allude to two very old jokes, but they're always worth repeating. The one is I would have a cartoon depicting the drunk looking for his keys under the street lamp, right? Not because that's where he lost them, because that's where the light is better. That's, I think, a perfect summation of the current mainstream, right? If it doesn't fit into their mathematical approach, they don't want to hear about it, which means you're throwing out all kinds of great things like subjective value, expectations, fallibility, ignorance, all the things that aren't convenient for math. They get tossed out, and this book will drive home the point about how important those things are. And if you throw those out, you've dehumanized economics and made it sterile, and why should anybody care about it? That's what I take from it. Now, if they had rejected that cover, I had a different cover, I would just have a picture of a can opener, because you all know the joke, right, about the economist stranded on an island with some other people, and all they have is canned foods, and the other people are from different professions, and they each tell what we should do, and the economist, they finally get to him and say, what should we do? He says, assume a can opener. Okay, because the the mainstream makes a whole bunch of unrealistic assumptions to get you to something without ever telling you how you get there and what's the point of it. As I say, by the way, if you want to read a longer review of this book by me, on Friday at the FFF.org website, my weekly Friday column, TGIF, will discuss this and make a little more sense of this. But anyway, whoops, I hit something there, that's right. Oh, now we'll have a lecture on space. So one of the things I thought of as I was reading this book, and keeping time here, it drove home a point that I had already been thinking about, but it really, I think, helped me think it through a little more, and I want to keep on this. But one of the things I think that keeps people from being open to this mainline view, the idea that markets are self-adjusting, the whole, as Pete sums it up nicely, just the invisible hand perspective. I think one thing that keeps people who may be arguing from just totally good faith, but I think it's not so much a theoretical objection. I'm not talking about professional economists necessarily, like Paul Krugman, but just people you encounter every day. Their objection when we proselytize about the market and how beautiful it is, their objection is not theoretical, it's not historical, it's not moral, it's aesthetic. Notice I use the word beautiful. We think markets are beautiful. I think human action is a work of art. And we see beauty in markets. And I think if you see that, if you grasp that, you're already a long way there. You just need his book to fill in a lot of the blanks. But people who don't see that, they have an aesthetic aversion. To them, there's something ugly about markets, they're not attractive. And I think we have to understand that and frame our arguments on behalf of markets with that in mind, because we'll argue differently if we think of it that way than if we think we're arguing with a person who's got a theoretical objection or even a moral objection. It's not even a moral objection, it's more an aesthetic objection. I just think there's something we need to think about there. A few other things that I take from this book, which I think are so valuable, and Pete covered it in his remarks here. This relationship between incentives and institutions. The book really drove home for me how closely related those two words are, those two concepts. I'm a language person. I'm an editor, I'm a writer, I'm a student of language. I love English, I love language generally. And just the way, the terms lock and key are intimately related. The idea of institutions and incentives are extremely intimately related, to the point where you can't understand one without understanding the other. And the book will lay this out for you beautifully. So much economics is like abstracted from institutions. Just like it's abstracted from humanity, it's also abstracted from institutions. Well, if you abstract from those two things, what do you have left? Why would it be worth it? And in fact, it's not worth it. So those two things go together, and I think we need to think of them together. When we hear incentives, we ought to think institution. When we hear institution, we ought to think incentives. You can't, it's like lox and bagel, okay? You can't separate them. And this goes to the Smith and Hume point about, whether to subsidize religion or not, okay? The institution affects incentives and vice versa. Another thing, he mentioned the 24/7 idea, how economics grabs you. Once you have this perspective, it sort of grabs you and never lets go. I spent a good part of last weekend, having just finished the book, watching on Netflix the first 2 seasons of a British series, which I'd never heard of. I just stumbled on it, called Monarchy. Has anybody watched it? It's the story of the English and British monarchy, beginning with King Alfred, and actually it goes before that. Presented by a historian by the name of David Starkey. Highly recommend it. Very nicely done, beautifully done. I assume, I'm not an expert on that, so I assume it was, more or less accurate, but it beautifully done. And one of the things I noticed in watching this, when you're watching the machinations of the kings and the deals they had to make, and sometimes they had to accommodate the people, sometimes they had to accommodate the barons, sometimes they had to cut deals with enemies. I was reminded of what Pete has to say about Buchanan in particular about this, about how exchange is everywhere, including within politics. Now, it's different because in my view, there's coercion. It's not just my view. Politics obviously has underlying coercion, unlike the free market. I mean, at least I would argue it that way. But even within that, there's all kinds of exchanges going on. So I don't know if I would have quite watched the series the same way if I hadn't just freshly read the book, because I could see it. It was just so obvious how, a king would have to cut a deal with his mortal enemy. He hated the guy. But there was something to be gained from that by, calming another group down that was maybe going to stage an uprising against you or something like. Oh, look at this. We're getting personal pictures now. I'm not touching it. What's going on? I'm not even touching it.
You don't have to see
There's
that.
there's me surfing. No,
Let's do that.
So he is right. The economic way of thinking, it's got a mind of its own. The economic way of thinking is, it does take over your mind, but it's a good thing, because economics is about people. It's about people interacting with other people for mutual benefit and for their self-interest. But as he, I think, Pete points out, you can take another shot at it. As Pete points out in the book, you don't want to interpret self-interest in self-interest will sound very narrow to people. This is another part of the aesthetics, right? Some people find the idea of self-interest ugly. And so, markets, that's people pursuing self-interest. Well, we need to find ways to explain to people, as Adam Smith understood, that self-interest doesn't mean just your narrow personal advancement in money terms or, even non-monetary. It's about your family, it's your friends, it's your community. Oh, that's, quote, selfish, right? That's because it's your family, your community, your larger circle of friends. So we need to watch our language. We need to watch our language, and to use a title I used recently in an article, mind your metaphors. We've got to be thinking about how are other people going to hear this. And don't forget, a lot of the people we're arguing with aren't starting from the economic point of view. So what we're saying, they may not be hearing it, what you're saying. They're hearing something else. So we need to be sensitive about that and find ways and talk among ourselves to say, well, how do you think this works? I mean, bounce it off other people first who do share this perspective, and then try it out. This is where Facebook and other things are good, because you can try out approaches, you can try out one-liners and see what kind of reaction you get. I mean, it's very useful for things like this. What else can I say about this book? As I mentioned, you'll get introduced to many, many interesting people, some of whom you might not ever end up reading just because your time's limited and you're doing other things. But at least you'll get some sense. I particularly enjoyed the chapter on Peter Berger, who was a sociologist, not an economist. And I was not aware of it. I mean, I knew of him, I'd heard of him, and I knew that people I respect thought a lot of him, so that already tells me something, but I didn't know anything firsthand. But from Pete, I learned he had this perspective, this invisible hand perspective, this humanistic perspective, that he applied to sociology, which is not common in sociology. He looks at society as just sort of some entity that doesn't really have people in it. It's just the Borg or the blob. And so you learn very interesting things about him and the reaction he got from his colleagues. I mean, the students loved his books, but his colleagues didn't like the books. Again, he had real living people in there, not maximizers, not robots, real people who are trying to make their lot in life better and their family, like I said, their families, but who are also fallible, who make mistakes, who have imperfect knowledge. I mean, it's real people. This is what we have to stress, because people have this sense that economics means, everybody's just, a rational robot working around making perfect calculations, or at least we think that, and of course that's ridiculous, so you must be wrong if that's what you think. In this regard, I remember something, if you don't mind my quoting Hillary Clinton here, not positively, of course, but she once said that an economist, she was dismissing economists for some reason, and she said an economist is somebody who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. Now, she got that wrong. That was an Oscar Wilde quote about cynics, not about economists, but notice how she thought that fit economists. Now, it might fit some economists, but it doesn't fit the economists that Pete's talking about, or the line that Pete is in. You could never accuse them of knowing the price of everything and the value of nothing, because there are real people. In Adam Smith, and he goes back further, Pete goes back further, he begins with Aquinas. I mean, he mentions them, he doesn't go into it, but he says this line of thinking really does go back into the Middle Ages. And those people had in mind not, these were never people you'd accuse of knowing the price of everything and the value of nothing. I'll wind this down now because, I'm eager to hear what Chris is going to say. All I can say is this is a very exciting book, a very useful book, and I don't want it to get the reputation as a book only for econ students. So if you're not an econ student, but you're here, so you're obviously interested, read the book. You're going to love the book. You'll probably read it more than once, and I wish Pete the greatest success with it. Thank you.
Well, let me first thank Bumper and Bart for organizing this and for having me here to speak. And it's truly a pleasure to be able to speak about Pete's book. I consider Pete to be the most important and effective and productive scholar, teacher, and program builder in Austrian economics today. And from the comments you heard, but also from the content of the book, I think that becomes very evident. So in my brief time today, I'd like to do a couple things. First, I'd just like to provide a few broad comments on the book, and then I just want to pick out what I think the most important lesson is, which is a theme that runs throughout. But I want to emphasize one thing which Pete made mention to, but I really want to make sure I hammer it home. So when I think of this book, I think of the living economics recipe. So what is it that goes into this book? And I think it's three things. It's part autobiographical, so we learn about Pete, how he became involved and excited and impassioned by the economic way of thinking, as well as the people that have influenced him in his, not just development, but in his career, and also how he has influenced students. Second, living economics is part history of thought. It traces the long and important history of the main line of economics. And the third is that, as Pete mentioned, he provides advice and guidance for young and aspiring economists. And it's really the blend of all these three things that makes living economics so effective. It's not just the blend of them, it's that Pete is able to put them together in an effective, cohesive, yet accessible manner that, as Sheldon mentioned, makes it readable, not just by those who are on the inside of the economics profession, but more importantly, to those who are interested in economics, but more importantly, in the progress of human civilization. One of the key things that comes out of this, and you've picked up on this for those of you who haven't met Pete today, before today, is his passion for the subject. And one of the things he always emphasizes to his students is that it's okay to be passionate about economics. As he mentioned, a lot of this is drained out of graduate students when they're trained in graduate school. But for Pete, it's all about that, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. Pete discussed his own introduction to economics through Hans Sennholz. I should also mention that I had a similar experience. Pete was my teacher, both as an undergraduate, where I met him at Manhattan College in New York City. That's the reason I got excited about economics in the first place. And after leaving undergraduate and working for a few years, I decided to go back to graduate school, and I came back to Mason to study with Pete. I left for 7 years, and then I came back to be part of the faculty. But I had the same experience, and Pete was able to introduce me to these ideas, show me just how powerful they were as an undergraduate, and then cultivate me as a graduate student and work with me very closely to teach me how to employ these tools, both as a teacher and as a scholar. So I'm always grateful for that. So given that kind of broad overview of what I think, why this book is important, let me touch upon what I think is the most important theme in the book, and you find that in the concluding chapter. Now, the concluding chapter is titled "A Few Critical Paragraphs That Should Shape What We Teach and Why We Teach Economics." And here's really the key line. It's on the first page of that conclusion. Pete writes, this is a quote, "The main line of economic teaching from Adam Smith to F.A. Hayek taught not only what economics can tell us, but more importantly, what it cannot tell us." And cannot is in italics. That's the end of the quote. So why is this important? Well, at the core of the mainline way of thinking is the idea that innovations in technology and knowledge are ultimately what drive societal progress. It's the division of labor and social cooperation under specialization that allows for increases in well-being and prosperity. The dilemma here is that if you try to apply that same way of thinking In other words, if you attempt to apply technological thinking to the perfection of society, the result is misery, suffering, and death, as is evidenced by the disastrous experiment with central economic planning. And from this perspective, capitalism, free markets, is its own worst enemy, because what happens is it's so effective in making people wealthy that it increases leisure time. It increases leisure time. People have lots of time to think. They think they're being do-gooders, and they come up with all types of do-gooder schemes to attempt to improve the world, which is, those throughout the mainline tradition have pointed out, actually leads to just the opposite. It leads to impoverishment and ends up making people worse off. So while central economic planning is largely dead, the idea that supposed enlightened experts with superior technological knowledge can somehow derive plans to improve the world around them, to perfect imperfect humans, still thrives. Just think about, for instance, what the Federal Reserve is attempting to do in the United States. Think about the global footprint of the US military that intervenes around the world under the guise of making the world safe and free. And we can think of millions of other interventions. Pete put some of these up when he made reference to the current situation we face today. But oftentimes, those of us, just like Sheldon, just like myself, who think the market is a beautiful thing, focus on the beauty of the market, all the good things that it generates. But what we oftentimes focus less on is the millions and millions of beautiful things that could have happened if it weren't for regulations, interventions, and barriers to peaceful interaction and social cooperation that could have taken place. The reason we don't think about these things is because it's sad. It's sad because we are, on a daily basis, impoverishing millions of people. But even for those of us who have the fortune of living in relatively wealthy societies, we could be even wealthier if we just allowed people to act and expand the lexis of socially beneficial interactions. What are the implications of this? Well, the title of Pete's last chapter focuses on teaching. The reason why is Pete wants to target this book, as he said, to advanced undergraduates and graduate students. Sheldon pointed out, rightfully so, I believe, I'm in full agreement with him, that there's a broader audience for this book. And what I want to suggest is that Pete actually underplays, both in his comments but also in the book, the power of the book and the importance of it. The main line of economics, as Pete discusses, has crucial implications for the way we do economics. When I say doing economics, that's teaching, as Pete mentions, that's academic research, but it's other things as well. It's public outreach, it's policy making and policy-related work. Of course, teaching goes into that, but that's just one aspect of doing economics. So if I had to pick one of the many insights in living economics to highlight and to drive home, it would be that the purpose of economics is not to offer solutions to perceived problems, but rather to understand the limits of human reason and the institutional arrangements which allow people to deal with their limitations in this regard. Now, this might sound like a small and subtle shift in emphasis, but when you realize what this change in focus actually entails, it's a radical challenge to the intellectual establishment, both inside the economics discipline and outside in the broader policymaking community. As Pete points out in chapter 20 of the book, that's the chapter titled The Limits of Economic Expertise, the economics profession today is dominated by what he calls saviors. Now, saviors are tasked with designing interventions to perfect man and markets. This savior mentality is driven by state intervention, which requires both policies, the actual design of policies, as well as legitimacy to support the interventions. As Pete and Sheldon pointed out, this is also driven by the way economics is taught in our graduate schools, which teaches economics as a tool of social control, which allows well-informed experts to solve market failures, while typically downplaying, if not altogether ignoring, government failures, which, as Pete pointed out, can be found all the way back in Hume. Pete's book and his larger body of work poses a serious challenge to this entrenched view of economics by demanding that economists and policymakers appreciate their ability to, as F.A. Hayek pointed out, design the world according to their wishes. Of course, Hayek said that when man tries to design the world according to their wishes, given the very constraints on their reason, they fall prey to what he called the fatal conceit. Now, I had planned to end with a booming rendering of that Mises quote. Pete stole my thunder. But I think it's a very important quote, because what Mises points out at the end of Human Action is, look, economics is a set of laws. As Pete said, it's living, but there's still a set of laws. And you can pretend that those laws don't apply, but you cannot avoid the consequences of pretending they don't apply. So it is my ultimate hope, not just that advanced undergraduates, not just that graduate students read this book, but that policymakers, that citizens who are interested, as I mentioned, in economics, but more broadly in the well-being of both the United States, but also of individuals around the world, pick up this book and read it very carefully. So in closing, let me congratulate Pete on an excellent book. I urge you all to read it very closely and to digest the many arguments that are in it. I guarantee it will be worth the investment, and it will be time well spent. So thank you all very much.
After those three great presentations, I feel a little sheepish because I realize that after welcoming you and talking about this great book, I totally failed to mention the name of the book, Living Economics. I'm sitting over there thinking, my gosh, you know, I go through this whole thing, I don't even mention the name of the book. So I'm glad they did. And so I thought, well, I would apologize and make up for it here at this juncture. Great book, Living Economics. Okay, why don't we open it up for a little bit of discussion, Q&A, and so forth. Please wait for the microphone to be passed to you so that we get it on the recording, and we'll open it up now.
Since we're doing autobiographical talks tonight, I had opportunity to spend a little time with Paul Hayek. How did you and David meet up with him? I sat down one summer and read The Economic Way of Thinking and said, oh, now I know enough to get through the world. Even though I've never taken an economics course, I know a lot of economics. And he was very fortunate to have you guys work in his other editions.
Thank you, Bill, for that. Paul was a very wonderful human being, as you know, a man who had deep commitments, moral commitments as well as intellectual commitments, and was a dedicated teacher. He actually gave up a tenure-track job at SMU to move to University of Washington, where he worked in Doug North's economics department when Doug North was the department chairman there, to teach the principles of economics. That's all he taught, and he ran the large section classes and coordinated all the graduate students. As a graduate student in economics at George Mason University in the early 1980s, we were heavily influenced as a department by Armin Alchin and the UCLA approach to price theory. So university economics was something that we all read. And I started teaching a course which, in my second year of graduate school, which was to teachers, to teach them economics so they could teach economics. And so this is around 1984 or 85. And couldn't use university economics. That was a little bit too difficult for that audience. So we were looking around for a book, and it was suggested that The Economic Way of Thinking was a book that was designed to communicate Alchin's basic ideas in a very readable way. And so I started teaching. And as a young kid, just started teaching, I did what like some young kids should do, as I'm staring at graduate students right now, which is I wrote to the author and asked him, you know, about like what would he do if he was in this case, you know, teaching, because I had a hard time because the course that I was teaching, it was for teachers here. The state of Virginia had passed a law that all teachers had to have some economic content, all right? And this meant that even second grade teachers had to do economics. And what started was I actually wrote to Bettina up at Bettina B.N. Graves up at Fee, and I said, like, where's the children's literature for second graders that I could teach economics from? And she wrote me back and told me to have the kids read The Little Red Hen. So that was an interest. I remember that. But I also, wrote to Paul and asked him what he would do in that situation. I don't remember that he gave me an answer to that, but what it started was he understood I was teaching from his book, and I ended up by using that book because I always taught a course which was a basic econ course, or an economics for the citizen is what it's called at George Mason. And so I ended up by always using the book for many years and meeting him at different, Liberty Fund conferences or other various different things. And so we got to know each other. And I wish I would have had him as a teacher, but I didn't have him as teacher, but I had him in that. And Dave Pacheco has a very similar story about being in touch with Paul because of the teaching and using of his book. So we took over the volume of the book in the, I think it was the 10th edition or the 9th edition, 9th or 10th edition. I guess it's the 10th edition. I think he did the 9th edition, then we took over in the 10th. We've done the 10th, 11th, 12th, and now the 13th. So that's right. So let me check with Tom, because Tony Carrilli, Tom's teacher, Tony Carrilli is a fantastic teacher of economics at Hampton-Sydney College. And he always tells me that he wants to constantly find copies only of the 9th edition, because once Boettke gets involved, it goes downhill from there. So I think it's the 9th edition that Tony is talking about. So I do think it's the 10th edition. But Paul Hayne was amazing, as you know. Yeah.
Yeah, let me throw in a question here, Pete, of a personal autobiographical nature. That when I was at Fee, you mentioned working with Israel Kirzner there when you were teaching at NYU and how you learned from him. When I was at Fee from 87 to 89, of course I met Kirzner because he would speak at the Fee seminars, and I was a seminar director. And I asked him if he would let me audit his classes there at NYU. And he said, not only will I let you audit it, you can actually participate in them. So I think it was a history of economic thought class one semester, another principles of economics. And it was the most exciting day of my week to go down and actually have the chance to hear Kirzner every week. And I learned so much, and it was just, one of the bright spots of those 2 years. And so I'm curious as to what your interaction with him was during those 7 years at NYU, and how you actually did learn from him.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was at NYU for 8 years, and he and I had met Israel when I was a graduate student. He actually had recruited me to come to graduate school at NYU rather than go to George Mason. And my wife and I went up to visit New York while we were making that decision, and our maid of honor in our wedding was an artist, and so she lived in Alphabet City in the East Village, which is all the Avenue A, Avenue B, Avenue C. Sort of, for those of you who are a little bit older and a little bit grungier, this is actually where, like, all the punk rockers were hanging out, at the time. So, Sex Pistols and all that stuff. And we stayed in this apartment, and Rosemary, while we were sleeping, had a giant cockroach go past her head. And so she said, we're not moving to New York, so we didn't. It was the best decision I ever made, because had I done that, I never would have ended up by working with Kirzner, and I would have been probably swallowed up in economics by the way the economics is taught at NYU. But it was the greatest day of my life. Not really, okay? I did get married, I did have kids, okay, like that. But professionally, the emotional excitement I got the day that I got the job at NYU was amazing to me. It was very much a high point in my life. The idea of being a kid from New Jersey who was going to get to teach at New York University with Israel Kirzner and where Ludwig von Mises taught, and all that stuff, it was very thing. So what's the main thing, the first thing about Kirzner? One is how dedicated he was to the craft of teaching. The sad reality for most of you who are out there, especially those of you who pay tuition for your kids to go to school, NYU is a very, really expensive school. And I remember sitting there at the time because I was writing checks for my kids to go to Catholic school. And I remember I was writing the check out for my kids to go to Catholic school, and I was thinking, who would I want my kid to study economics with here that I'd be willing to write the $40,000 a year check? And I know the behavior of my colleagues, and I remember thinking, Israel Kirzner, that's a school of one. Everyone else, there's no way in hell. I'd demand a refund, if I was a parent. So one of the things that Kirzner did was he put a note up on his door, and it was a very awkwardly worded note, which it said something like, if this door is shut and you hear typing, do not knock, right? And he would put this note up an hour before he would go to teach. And whatever class he was teaching, now keep in mind, he was at the back end of his career when I joined the staff at NYU, so he had taught these classes for 30 years. He started teaching at NYU in 1957. And I went there in 1990. I was there from 1990 to 1998. And he still put up an hour of preparation for him to perfect his notes when he did it. So as you also would know, Steve would know this because you had him as a teacher in the summer program. You know this from being in these things. He's an amazingly articulate economist too. It's a craft that's associated with his lectures. There's no spitballing it, right? I mean, it's a crafted thing. And he perfected that. And I remember, there would be something really important, or I thought was important programmatically for, what was going on at NYU at the time. And I'd be down there and I go, I got to talk to Israel. And then the note would be up, if this is it. And behind the thing, he'd be redoing his notes and crafting it and everything like that. And you just never knocked on the door because that was his time to prepare, and you didn't ever interfere with that. The other thing that was amazing about him is we ran a research workshop every week. And Kirzner came with the paper and red pen. Always had a red pen. And the paper would be filled with red comments and everything like that. Never once did he come in to a seminar with a blank paper that he hadn't read thoroughly and examined everything. So I think the number one thing I learned from him was a work ethic issue. And then the carefulness with which he made economic arguments. And I often think that I was very fortunate because Jim Buchanan, who was my teacher as a graduate student, he emphasized creativity, right? He also was a big work ethic person, as anyone who knows him was, 6 to 6, hard, work ethic. But he emphasized creativity in economic thought. So he was more likely to take an oddball idea from any source. I have a fortune cookie thing on my, that's not the right word. I don't have the fortune cookie. I have the fortune that's inside the fortune cookie pinned up on my door at the office. And I have it there because I think it captures Buchanan better than any other phrase. It says that the wise man will learn more from the fool than the fool will ever learn from the wise man. And the reason why I picked that out, besides the fact that I had good fortune to pick it out of a fortune cookie once, but why I put it up on the door was because when I was a student, Buchanan, I had the good fortune of having Buchanan as a student before he won the Nobel Prize, so he wasn't flying all over the place, right? And a student would ask a question in class. Really, some of them were like the stupidest questions I've ever heard in my life, and Buchanan would twist them and turn them into wisdoms, pearls of wisdom. Now, what did he achieve by that in the classroom? One, he made the student feel good about themselves. He turned them into a pearl of wisdom by his reinterpretation of them. And the rest of us all learned, right, from the process. Now, compare that to my other teacher, Gordon Tullock, who, I love Gordon Tullock, so don't get me wrong, but Gordon Tullock's class was like a class in jiu-jitsu. And so what he would do is you could have a pearl of wisdom, and he would like try to chop you to death, like that, and and chop you down and make you really, and tear you apart. And that's the way he taught, right? And so there's a certain benefit from surviving the jiu-jitsu of Gordon Tullock, but it wasn't the same thing as you get from Jim Buchanan. So when I left graduate school, I had this kind of idea about, we got to push out boundaries, we got to think new thoughts, and then you get Kirzner, and he's like, you got to be articulate, you got to be disciplined. And I like to think, I don't embody this, but I like to think of like Kirzner and Buchanan combined, you get creativity within discipline. And that's the source of innovation. So innovation, as Chris said before, is the source of the dynamism in an economy. But it's not just wishful conjectures all over the place. It's always wishful conjectures disciplined by profit and loss accounting. That's what leads to great innovations, right? Great ideas get translated into commercially valuable ideas when they can meet a profit test. And it's the same thing in science. In science, you have a play between things that are of intrinsic worth, things that are plausible, and things that are creative. And it's the interaction and tension in scientific work that generates that. And I tend to think of that as embodied in both the work of Kerzner and Buchanan, so they become very important figures in the way that I think about the way we do economics and all of that. So I don't know if that answered your question, but to me, Kerzner is simply a physical, personal embodiment of the humility and dedication of a scholar. He's like a scholar's scholar, right? And I think that we can all just aspire to live up to that. I certainly don't feel that I live up to it, but I feel very fortunate that I was exposed to it.
Yeah, that was my feeling as well.
For those of you who don't have the effort to get Kerzner, there's a video, there's a really cool audio tapes that were produced of his class. Laissez-faire used to sell them, on his class on undergraduate class, which is a very rare thing because most of his teaching was at the graduate level. But he has a class on capitalism, and you can get the audio tapes and you can see him try to communicate ideas at the basic economics level, and that's really pretty impressive actually, because he does do that and does articulate that.
Yeah, and its clarity of expression is just incredible. It is absolutely incredible.
Yeah, when you were reading the blurb from Buchanan, I have to say, I had nothing to do with the blurbs. That was the Independent Institute. And they went a little overboard, I understand, right? Chris likes to make fun of me because there's more blurbs than there's probably pages on the book. But anyway, but when I got the blurbs came in, obviously, you know, authors are always flattered when people say nice things about what they're doing. But I have to say that the blurb, if you go do that, I will highlight the blurb from Kerzner, because that was the one that I was really kind of most blown away by, that he would say those kind of things, because I respect, you know, what he's done and the stick-to-itness of the way he's approached and dealt with this, especially given that NYU has been historically a very inhospitable place. And Kerzner has no bitterness. He's a completely non-bitter academic. And he lived throughout his career in a place that was very, very hostile towards his life mission.
Can I tell one quick anecdote about Kerzner, actually a personal anecdote, just to drive home this idea of the influence he has on people. Years ago, when I was working at the Foundation for Economic Education, I took my kids, who were in those days pretty young kids, up to Fee for the beginning of the Austrian, or not, maybe it wasn't the beginning, but the advanced Austrian seminar that they used to do, and Kerzner would speak. So I had my very young kids sit through this lecture. They were really just indulging me. We weren't going to stay the whole week or anything, but I said, no, sit down. This is an important guy. Okay, jump ahead many years. My kids are now grown. My youngest is, what, 26, 7, I forget. And for some reason, Kerzner's name came up, and I was with them one day. This is just last year or the year before. I said, do you remember when you were really small, I took you to see Kerzner speak? And they said, yeah, I kind of remember that. I said, do you remember anything of that? And I think my son, who was the youngest of the three, said, or maybe it was my daughter, my second daughter, so the middle child said, yeah, he said that if you want to go north, don't stand on the south platform of the subway. And that's exactly what Kerzner was talking about as the role of the economist. Yeah. He's more or less is the one who says, if you want to go north, don't stand on the south side. And it's amazing that stuck with my little kid. I was just flabbergasted by that. That's the influence of Kerzner.
Yeah. Anyone else?
So want to thank all of you for the very interesting panel. So I have a question, but I also have some sort of curmudgeonly footnotes. First of all, on page 17, so first one is on the textbook issue, and I feel kind of retrograde because actually the first book I studied out of was Alkene and Allen Exchange Production and Use, and then the first book I ever taught out of was Paul Hayne, but lately I've taken the Mankiw. So I may be going downhill, but on page 17, I think it's a bit misleading. You maybe should be aware of this. It says, refer to fresh and eager minds finding themselves sitting in an economics class who will have purchased a textbook that costs close to $100. Well, 2011, when I checked, paperback Mankiw micro was $150, and I think this fall when I used Mankiw, I think it was $200. So you may want to update, and of course, corresponding to that, this Maryland legislature in their wisdom now has the College Textbook Affordability Act, which we all have to deal with. So, so that's one point. On your issue that the issue of what to make of it, that the proceeds from this book are now going to the to George Mason, I think you.
No, UFM, University of Francisco Mariquine.
University of Francisco Mariquine, but it's still the same principle. I don't know if you were aware of this, but one of the big sticking points in Hayek going to the University of Chicago was that the university was going to require him to sign what was called the infamous 4E contract, which required that all proceeds from speaking authorship go to the university, would not be in the hands. And Hayek had really big issues with that. Yeah. And it raises the Adam Smith issue of sort of what are the incentives, if you're right, the David Hume, Adam Smith incentive of, for you to be writing this book when, it looks like a great book, but I haven't read it yet, but I'm just saying, so I just thought you should be aware of that sort of issue with the 4E contract. So those are just some footnotes I wanted to mention. But the question I wanted to ask, I just finished writing a review of a book called What is the Use of Economics? And I don't know if you've heard of this book, but it was based on a conference last year in the United Kingdom where they were trying to cope with the sort of aftermath of the financial crisis. They had like 25, both US and UK, very prominent economists, a lot of guys from Harvard were there and so on. But the episode that initially gave rise to this was an episode in 2008, which I'd heard about before. I don't know if you heard about this, where there was at the dedication of a new building at the London School of Economics, the Queen of England was there. And I don't know if I didn't know about this episode before, but anyway, she put the question to the director of research at the London School of Economics, why didn't you guys see the credit crunch coming? I lost 25 million pounds in net worth myself or something like that. And so it raises the question of how would you have responded to that sort of question? And it was interesting actually in this book, the range of views that sort of mainstream, we'll call it mainstream, not mainline economists take to that issue, everywhere from, we don't see any need to change anything at all to the profession is in sort of fundamental crisis. And there is this issue, the living economics part, to what extent is sort of mainstream economics, does it respond to sort of changes, anomalies, and so on? And there seems to be different points of view of that, but what is your sense of that issue of, and especially in light of the recent economic crisis, this issue has come up.
So David's relaying a kind of a moment in which the Queen is at the LSE and she's speaking to Tim Besley, who was the host for Chris and myself when we were fellows at the LSE. And that requires a response from the economists in London. And I should point out that this also happened in the United States. People were dragged before Congress and had to explain dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models to congressmen and why it is that NSF funded research on this and that this turned a blind eye to what led to the financial crisis. And there was kind of a spectacle about all of that. Part of the issue that I have with economics in general, so my response to these things is that economics is not a tool and should not be expected to be a tool for those in power to utilize to control society. And instead, the economist is kind of like the role that the jester played in the old court, which was to speak truth to power and to be the one that can actually tell those in powerful positions the buffoonery of their actions, right? It turns out, by the way, the jester always goes too far, and the king doesn't like what they say, but that's also the fate of economists. So I think that's, so in fact, it's funny that you bring that up, David, because I was just, an article that Chris and I just published in the Cambridge Journal of Economics begins with that very episode. It's actually a paper that you might find of interest. It's got a weird title now because our other co-author, Pete Leeson, likes to come up with snappy titles. And so it's called Earwig, like the bug. I can't hear you because your ideas are too old. But it's a defense of history of economic thought against the charges that all that matters in economics is what's currently taught rather than what was previously taught. And we motivate the paper by a discussion of the financial crisis and this particular episode with the Queen and as well as Congress and the re-examination of economics that this forces us to think about. But with respect to the Living Economics book, the chapter that's most relevant for that debate is the one that Chris mentioned on the limits of economic expertise and the way in which economics as a profession was transformed in the 20th century because we transformed economics from being a student or a philosopher of society to a social engineer or savior of society. And that transformation has with it both expectations and responsibilities. And when those responsibilities are not lived up to, then those in positions of power can do things like what the Queen did or what Congress does. But when economics is not, we argue in another piece in that, which actually its origins in the co-authored piece with Chris on the battle for the soul of economics. It's called High Priests and Lowly Philosophers. And it makes an argument in the book that economists should be lowly philosophers and not high priests. And that the problem is that what's wrong with modern economics, and please understand something, for someone like David, I'm a little ham-fisted in the history of thought and as well as in some of these discussions because I'm forcing through an interpretation which I think is ultimately right, but there's certain subtle nuances that sometimes I just like run through with like I'm driving through an argument. So I would say it differently in some other context, but the basic idea here is that we corrupted our soul as economists because we demand that economics do things that we know economics can't do, but yet we demand that they do it anyway. Okay? So that's the issue of the idea of economics as a tool of social control. And if what we do is we expect economics to do that, but economics can't provide that, but we tell everyone, we end up by winking at one another, right? Like, yep, we're doing that, but we know we can't do it. We can't accomplish it. And that has a corrupting influence on the scientific development of the tradition. And that's one of the more radical arguments that's in the book. It's like the Hayek critique of scientism combined with a kind of a public choice sort of critique of rational choice scientists about why it is that economics goes in the direction that it does. But yeah. So if I would be like Ludwig von Mises, by the way. So I have two stories about Mises that I'll tell. So the first one is Mises is at the Chamber of Commerce, which is the equivalent position to the Council of Economic Advisors, okay, in his relevant time period in Vienna. And Vienna is suffering from a hyperinflation. So as the story goes, I have no idea if this is true or not. It might be just a made-up story. But as the story goes, the people come to Mises and they say to him, Professor Mises, we have hyperinflation. How can we stop it? And he says, meet me here at midnight. And so they meet him at his office at midnight and they say, what do we do, Professor Mises? He says, follow me. And then he leaves the building and walks down to where the printing press is going. He takes him to that building. The printing press is going, he goes, turn it off. So that's the first line. Mises is then later asked, what would he do if he was the economic czar? right? Which is a classic line, you're the economic czar, what would you do? And he says, I would abdicate. And I think that that's the line that we should hold as economists. And instead of being would-be saviors, embrace our role as philosophers of society, of social critics of society, and teachers of logic and fact, and be happy with that role in society. Yeah.
Quick follow-up. So in light of this, you had the three substantial propositions that you mentioned. So would you see there ever being any new substantial propositions being added to that body? And would you see any scope for modifications of the three ones that you named?
Sure. That's a great question, actually. So I think ultimately, so this is going to sound a little weird, I think ultimately that's the core propositions of economics that unites economists over time. That to put it in lack of certain terms, that would be our hard core, okay? And then at the edges, we branch out and we have other kinds of things which are both applications of those ideas and sort of new twists. But the ultimate idea that it's about strategies and rules. So I would, one of the things, I guess, who said it? Was it Sheldon said it? Or, Jim Buchanan likes to say the following thing. Same players, different rules, different games. Same players, different rules, different games. I don't think that core idea, which, by the way, is really the rationality hypothesis, institutional analysis, and invisible hand, okay? I don't think that core propositions are subject to the kind of modifications about asymmetric information and these kind of things. In fact, that's one of my critique in the book, is that we teach our principal students all the exceptions to the principles, and then what happens is they remember the exceptions, they don't remember the principles. All right? And what we need to do is teach them the principles. Now, I also think that there are failures, right, and imperfections, but I would see the solution to those as being in the changes in the rules, right? So what we need to do is we need to make sure the property rights structure is aligned correctly. And that's what we would go and look at. So the final thing I would say to you is that part of the subtext of the book is the claim that we've gone through a series of arguments which I think are incomplete. All right? So let's imagine, again, this is a little rough around the edges interpretation. But imagine that what we used to believe was that it was a debate between a perfect market versus perfect government, right? What happens? Then what we did was we said, too bad we have imperfect markets, but we still have perfect government, so let's just turn it over to the perfect government. Then we said, wait a minute, we have imperfect markets, but we also have imperfect government, so now we're agnostic. And I think we're at the new stage now, which is follows. This is a mantra that I would argue as an entrepreneurial economics. Markets fail, use markets to fix the failure. All right? A profit opportunity, a market imperfection today represents a profit opportunity for the entrepreneur who knows how to react to that and fix it. And so what we have is a lot of situations where when we impose rules because of so-called imperfections, we're cutting the story short before it's actually taken place. Because the fact that we have imperfections is what spurs entrepreneurial innovation. If we had perfection, there'd be no reason to have entrepreneurial innovation. But it's precisely because, or an analogy Kerzner uses a lot of times is, it's precisely because of the friction between the soles of my feet and the ground that I'm able to walk. If I tried to walk in a frictionless environment, I would end up on my keister. From New Jersey, we would say other words, but Kerzner is a very proper man. That's the issue with the market. So this is like one of the papers. This is an Alchin argument about the positive role of frictions, right? So, you know, in most of economics, we think about frictions as being the things that cause the imperfection. But it's actually the reason why markets work is because we have frictions, right? It's because the reason why markets work is because we have asymmetric information. Not that that's the reason why they fail. The reason why markets work actually is because we start with monopoly. And what happens is the monopoly privileges get dissipated away through competition. All right? And that's how markets operate. It's not that markets begin with an infinite number of buyers and sellers, right, and all these things. Instead, markets start out as bilateral monopolies. And then what happens is people compete away as innovation comes in, a profit opportunity appears, people follow it, imitate it, come down, right? And that's how markets operate. That's the appreciative theory of the market as opposed to the formal theory of the market. And I want to sort of switch the emphasis that we place. We should be teaching more about the appreciation of markets and then have the footnotes. So this is a great story. Dick Wagner's my colleague, fantastic colleague. And I love him and the stories he tells. So here's a story that he likes to tell, which is that when he was a graduate student, he was taking a course from Ronald Coase. And Ronald Coase used 2 books to teach price theory from. Alfred Marshall's Principles of Economics and Milton Friedman's Provisional Text, teaching price theory. And what is fascinating about this is that in Marshall's book, the text is made up of all the stories, right? The fish market, all these different kind of things. But then the appendices and the footnotes have the technical apparatus presented in it that lies the underlying logic, pursues the underlying logic. By the time you get to Friedman, it's reversed, okay? And that the text is made up of the presentation of the technical apparatus, and the footnotes tell us a story or an illustration of what the theory is supposed to be doing. So Wagner, this is in 1960s when Wagner had this. So when I'm talking to him about it, it's the 1990s, and he says to me, he says, now take a look at Varian's book. He goes, they cut out all the footnotes. So all you have is the technique. You no longer have any of the narrative, which is why it is that we want to use economics to begin with. That I want to switch that emphasis. It's not that I'm against, you know, deductive logic or empirical examination with sophisticated tools and techniques. Any exact opposite, actually. I want an economics that's embedded in logic and evidence, not emotion. But I want us to be able to emphasize the appreciative aspects of the market, all the things that we can't fit in our formal theory that make markets things that are desirable for us. I want my students who will never take another economics class, let's say those teachers, right, that are in my class, I want them to understand about responsibility, accountability, right, responsiveness to of markets, variety, innovation, all of the kind of things that are not necessarily captured in the standard way we teach perfect competition, imperfect competition, monopoly, blah, 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 right? And so I want to kind of get across that dynamics, and that's a point of emphasis as a point of, you know, background. So think in terms of that Alfred Marshall, Milton Friedman to Hal Varian evolution. We like Alfred Marshall.
I want to make a quick comment, again, as a student of language, as an editor. This is something I've thought about before. Actually, a David Friedman article in Liberty magazine made me think of this, about market failure. I think we already hurt ourselves by calling it market failure. Now, I don't want to get into the argument of whether there are market failures or not market failures. That's not my point. A market failure is really what? A situation where the rational thing for each individual to do ends up being a suboptimal outcome,
right,
when you consider everything. Well, that's not a feature only of the market, right? When we talk about government failure, it's a similar thing. Friedman gives the example of a line, an army, right, that's standing there while a charge is coming from the opposing army on horseback. It's rational for any one of the members to flee, right? But if they all think that and they all flee, then they're all going to get outrun by the horses and slaughtered. So that's not a market, that's a war. And prisoner's dilemma's not a market, that's 2 guys getting arrested for a crime. So it's not why do we call it a market failure? It's a human failure doesn't, I don't know, I have a term for it yet. Collective failure? I don't want to say human failure because that focuses maybe too much on the individual. It's a problem of collective action, to steal a title from Mansur Olson. So let's stop calling it market failure, because I think we stigmatize the market by even talking in terms of market failure. It's something bigger than the market. It transcends the market. It plagues all of life. But the advantage, and this is what Friedman pushes, and you just did, in the market, there's an incentive to fix it, because you got profit incentives. In the government context, you don't. In fact, you got an incentive to aggravate it, because you can beef up your budget and all that stuff.
Can I say one thing about editors, which I want to, it's a belated acknowledgement here, but Sheldon was the editor on my first book. IHS used to have a program when Sheldon was the publications director there, and they would work with actually David Beto and myself, I think. I'm not sure how many other books were in it. Roy Cordato. So there's, okay, so four books or so. And IHS used to work with young scholars who had written a book to help them edit the book, you know, professionally, to bring it, to make it more readable and whatnot. And my book, The Political Economy of Soviet Socialism, benefited tremendously from Sheldon's guiding hand. And I should owe you a note of gratitude, and also, anyway, thank you very much for that, because I think people read it in a way that they wouldn't have read had it not been for Sheldon's guiding hand. And in this last book, much of, as Chris alluded to and other people alluded to, a lot of the papers are made up of papers that I've published over the years, but they were not completely rewritten, but rewritten in a certain way to make them more accessible rather than the technical aspects. And that was my son, Matthew, who helped me do that, in particular the transitions between, and he's an artistic type. He's a musician and a performance artist, and he was off from school for about 1.5 years, and he worked at the university with us, and this is one of the jobs that he did, and he did a great job, I think, in doing that, and that's been one of the reasons why I think the book has also been accessible and not as disjointed as it might have been had it just been like, say, my other book, more recent book, which was just a collection of my essays or whatever. There's a sort of integration that goes on. And I should also say I benefited tremendously in this book by the co-authors that I've had and the graduate students I've worked with throughout my career. So when I was at NYU, I co-authored one article with a graduate student, and that was it. I didn't work with graduate students. I just did my own stuff. I co-authored with classmates of mine from graduate school, Steve Horowitz and Dave Perchitko, but I didn't really work with graduate students. And when I went to George Mason, that was my game plan, because that's what, you know, I did. But I had this tremendous fortune in the early 2000s to get to work with Chris and Pete Leeson and a few other graduate students at that time, but mainly those two. And we really developed a very formidable team of being able to generate a lot of research. And we were successful at getting those pieces published. And a lot of those ideas were translated and put out into this book as well. So I actually view this book, it is a product of it's very much a product of me, but me is also a product of the people that I've worked with tremendously, and in particular Pete and Chris, who have really been fantastic colleagues for me, you know, at George Mason, and have kept me excited about economics. And Chris is now our DGS at GMU, and part of the new fresh blood of ideas that is coming in GMU, and I think we're poised for some great things. So thank you, Chris.
One quick word. It's been revealed now how far back Pete and I go. It's true. In the second half of the 80s, I was at IHS, senior editor and director of publications, and Pete was your grad student, hanging out a lot at the IHS. Yours was the first book I believe I ever was asked to edit, your dissertation. So I learned a heck of a lot, not just about the content of the book, but about the editing trade. Yeah. By working with you. So I'm as proud to have that on my record as you are, because of the book. I mean, it was a great pleasure, and I love doing it.
Okay, anyone else?
Thinking about your high priests and institutions like NYU, and especially the distinction between the main line and the mainstream, to me, the main line is, to use Sheldon's word, so beautiful. It explains so much, it's so rich, there's so much texture there. For any academic, any scholar, there should be more than enough to want to spend a lifetime studying. And then I look at the mainstream as it's evolved since, Samuelson in the 50s. It's sterile, it's little, it's tawdry. And as an engineer, it's actually kind of offensive to me because I know it's not real. I know what you can do with math. I can put a dune buggy on the top of a pile of explosives and land it on Mars 18 months later. That's what real math does for you. And as you pointed out, the mainstream can't do that. It's make-believe. So my question is, how has it survived for 50 years? How has it thrived? And how has it displaced us?
Okay, so I have a variety of different hypotheses about that. But let me just tell you the story about Hayek, because actually that's kind of an interesting story right on this idea. So, and think about this as an intellectual strategy and how weird it must have appeared to Hayek and to Hayek's friends and his students. So I tell this story in a chapter called on Hayek. It's my Hayek lecture at the LSE. That's in the book. But it's very fascinating to understand that Hayek was the leading thinker or counterpoint to Keynes in the 1930s. Sir John Hicks has a wonderful essay called The Hayek Story, which sort of explains this. It's not like Hayek was a minor figure that wasn't paid attention to. He's the major sort of intellectual battle. And his students include people like Abel Lerner. Abel Lerner wrote his dissertation with F.A. Hayek, right? The Economics of Control is his dissertation under Hayek's chairmanship. And Nicholas Kaldor is associated with Hayek at the early 1930s. And Hicks himself is associated with Hayek in the early 1930s. All these people move over to come with Keynes. So Hayek is confronted in the 1930s with two fundamental realities, which are at odds with what he believes to be the reality of economics. So in early 1930s, he gives an address called The Trend of Economic Thinking. He makes a very simple argument. If you believe in economics, the truth of economics, and the laws of economics, you're more or less a laissez-fairist. If you are not a laissez-fairist, you must not believe in the laws of economics. And the trend of economic thinking is about people that are challenging the laissez-faire aspects of economics and how they do it from, in fact, challenging the idea that theory exists, historicists, institutionalists, and whatnot. Yet by the mid-1930s, the main critics of laissez-faire economics are, in fact, theorists, right? The very theorists that Hayek thought would never go astray, right? Because you learned economics, they would understand these positions. So this is what leads Hayek into a puzzle. How is it that I lost all my students? How is it that people like as bright as Joseph Schumpeter are now saying things like socialism's possible, right? How is it that they could come to that position? So how does Hayek choose to respond? He does try to respond on an economics grounds, but what's his real argument? He goes at a meta-argument. They must have read Saint Simon, right? This is the counter-revolution, right? They had they were Cartesian rationalists as opposed to evolutionary epistemology. He goes to an epistemological level. That's his abuse of reason project, which he starts. The Road to Serfdom is really the first book in that, but it culminates in the counter-revolution of science. And then his work later on. Hayek makes a philosophical turn. And he also makes an institutional turn. He turns to law and politics as the framework in which, because people are not paying attention to the framework, and they don't pay attention, and they're not paying attention to the framework because of a philosophy of science which has them gone astray. Now, this was a completely failed strategy on Hayek's part, right? I mean, Milton Friedman was much more successful, which was to say, okay, let me play by the rules that you're playing by, and I'm going to show you that if I tweak the assumptions this way, we end up by getting the opposite conclusions of what you did within the framework that you adopted. All right? But Hayek basically was a total jettison of the existing framework and saying, no, we should be thinking about it differently. And so that forced him to go on a long detour outside of economics. As he says, when he won the Nobel Prize, right, he's the only economist who ever went senile and then came back again, right? So it was a long path in between, and he never really did quite return to economics proper, right? So we might say, geez, Hayek, that's kind of a sad, weird story. But I actually think you can't answer the question unless you get Hayek's position. And I think Hayek's position was maybe a little too esoteric, especially for an American audience, because the idea that French rationalism had a huge influence on the thinking in American culture is a little strange. But what I would recommend for you is a book by Vincent Ostrom, who again is another character in my book. The Ostroms are very prominent people. 2 chapters are devoted to them. And Vincent Ostrom wrote a book called The Intellectual Crisis in American Public Administration, which I think is extremely important for anyone who does history of economics, especially history of 20th century economics, because what Ostrom points out is how the progressives transformed the way we understood the task of public administration. And my argument would be is that economics responded rationally, economists responded rationally to the change in the rules and expectations of what public administration was supposed to deliver for us. So even though it goes in a direction that I disagree with, it's a self-reinforcing equilibrium. The progressives demand that policy be able to do X, right? Economists responded by providing theories that enabled them to do X. When all the evidence comes in that they're not able to accomplish X, the priors are so strong that the way that you update, all right, is to find alternative ways in which you would explain the failure of your theories. So you got to keep in mind that in addition to the progressives and the way economists developed, the idea of updating our theories, so we don't change economic perspectives like we change underwear. All right? And so as a result, we have very strong priors, and it's difficult for people to overturn those. And so what happens is they update in a way that's consistent with their theories, rather than update in a way that would be consistent with the one true model of the world. So we get theory-consistent updating, not a dovetailing to the one true model of the world, because, again, we don't pay individually a serious enough cost for being wrong. Right? If we made it be that like the incentives of science were aligned in such that if you were wrong, right, then you would suffer some real like the same way that if Bill Gates is wrong in making a software decision or an investment decision, right, that's sort of real. We don't have that same kind of idea. We have kind of loose mechanisms, our reputation, things like that, but it's not the same way. So I think that if you look at, again, I'm going to be accused of being weird in the same way Hayek says, go read, Cartesian rationalism, and you want to be, an evolutionary thinker rather than a Cartesian rationalist. I happen to agree with Hayek on that. But the way I would translate it into American politics is through Vincent Ostrom's work on the transformation of American public administration and what happened with Wilson and going forward. By the way, you can find the roots of what happened in American progressives in the very thing that Hayek is talking about. So I think ultimately Hayek is right, that those roots transform from Europe into the United States in a way of thinking. But most Americans don't know that, they don't think about it, so I would just stick with Ostrom's thing and then see the relationship between that. One last thing on that, Milton Friedman was awesome on this, actually. So again, as a reference, I point to all of you to look at Milton Friedman's review of Abba Lerner's Economics of Control, in which what he points out to Lerner is that, Abba, your logic is impeccable, but you treat public policy as if it's done in a vacuum. And public policy is never done in a vacuum. So your theories are irrelevant. They're logically sound, logically valid, but irrelevant. And I think that's the problem of economics. All right. Now, one other thing that will put me even in more trouble with Mark is a few years ago, I, on a plane, was experimenting with iTunes University. And I downloaded the lectures from Oxford on critical reasoning and the introduction of philosophical reasoning, of learning how to make an argument, the difference between a sound and valid argument, all these things like that. And when I was listening to it, I thought, oh my God, economists in the 20th century, because of formalism and positivism, had forgotten the strictures of critical reasoning and don't make this distinction in their minds between sound arguments and valid arguments. And what we do is we produce valid arguments, which then we hope will be tested against the empirical data that will then sort it out, but we don't actually make what would be called good arguments, right? And so that caused a whole problem in our modeling stratagem. And so we have to go back and take lectures in deductive logic from Oxford Dons, not the ones that don't stare at you, but the ones on iTunes University, right? Again, that do that. But I think that we have a kind of a weird thing. We thought formalism meant rigor, and we thought statistical analysis meant, we could compete or sort out the competing hypotheses. And I think both of them were a failed effort in science. Long-winded answer, sorry.
On that note, we have to wrap up.
Oh.
Our time has expired, right, Bart? Yeah. And so I want to thank the
I'm
three
sorry.
speakers.
Thank you.
Great presentations, and I love the way the Q&A session turned out. I mean, I almost felt like we were in a living room having a conversation. I love the way it developed. I want to give some thanks to a guy that's been very, very helpful to us for the past few years, and that's Matt Gottschalk, our videographer. Matt videotapes all our Economic Liberty lecture series, all the programs we do. He went on our College of Liberty, our Civil Liberties tour out west, and his work is first class. You'd be shocked at his clients. He has gigantic clients on a national level, and he comes and he videotapes our stuff because he loves what we do. He's a libertarian. He gives us a very, very generous nonprofit discount. And thank you, Matt. Thanks for the great work you've done for us. And finally, thank you for coming out. I mean, you made the program tonight. It was great having you interact. And we're going to have a little bit of an informal session afterward where you can still buy books and have them signed. And thank you very much. The meeting's adjourned.